Thank you so much for having me on. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I also have the AC running at my office, so hopefully it's not too loud. But APHA is just a fabulous partner for the Lung Association and has been for so many years. And we're so grateful for all of the amazing work that all of you are doing. So thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. So my name is Diana Van Vleet. I am the National Director of Outreach and Engagement for the American Lung Association's Healthy Air campaign. And the Healthy Air campaign has been working on federal clean air and climate advocacy efforts for over a decade. So a little bit about what we do. We track policies and efforts related to air pollution and climate change happening in the administration, in Congress, and also in the federal courts. And we help rally support from the health and medical community in support of science-based policies that reduce air pollution and address climate change. Some of the ways that we do that are that we convene a coalition of national health and medical organizations, including the American Public Health Association. And we meet weekly to discuss some of the latest federal policy efforts around climate change and clean air. We help organize joint comments to the administration on relevant proposals or regulations. We help organize joint press statements, calls with the EPA and the White House Office of Management and Budget. We recruit speakers for public hearings and hold joint press events. There's a lot of different tactics we use. But I know that the specific ask was on this West Virginia versus EPA case, which is one of the ways that we have been involved in advocacy alongside EPHA. So I'll get into the weeds, and I might be going a little bit too far into the details here, but it's such a, there's just so much detail on the legal end. So I'm maybe including a little too much here, but so in June, the Supreme Court issued its opinion in the West Virginia versus EPA case. The decision limits EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from coal and oil-fired power plants. And I'll get a little bit into the background of this. So under the Clean Air Act, EPA is required to set regulations to protect people from unsafe levels of air pollution. And previous court cases have confirmed that this responsibility includes limiting the emission of greenhouse gases that cause climate change. So that falls under the Clean Air Act. In 2015, under the Obama administration, EPA finalized the Clean Power Plan, which set federal rules to limit greenhouse gas emissions from existing power plants. When they did, ALA, APHA celebrated. This is a huge win. But several industry groups and some states sued in the federal court to block the Clean Power Plan. And the Supreme Court prevented the regulations from going into effect while the cases slowly worked their way through the courts. And so the Clean Power Plan was never implemented, actually. And then if you fast forward to 2019, under the Trump administration, EPA repealed the Clean Power Plan, which again, never went into effect, but they officially repealed it, and they tried to replace it with the Affordable Clean Energy Act, or the ACE rule. This rule includes much weaker measures, or included much weaker measures to address greenhouse gases from the power sector. And there were actually some analysis that showed that if the ACE rule was implemented, pollution would actually be worse than doing nothing at all. So it's really bad. And along with APHA and some others, the American Lung Association filed a lawsuit against the ACE rule with our attorneys at the Clean Air Task Force, arguing that it violated the Clean Air Act by not adequately protecting public health from climate change. Great news, we won our case in the lower court, and the ACE rule was effectively overturned. Okay, and then getting back into this most recent Supreme Court case. So again, Clean Power Plan repealed, was never implemented, ACE rule was overturned. In 2021, several states led by West Virginia appealed to the Supreme Court asking for a decision on how broad the EPA's authority is to limit greenhouse gases from the power sector. Unfortunately and surprisingly, the Supreme Court agreed to take the case. So West Virginia versus EPA which is, the case that everyone's referring to back in June, consolidated several cases together, including APHA and the Lung Association's lawsuit over the ACE rule. The Supreme Court decision that came out in June was 6-3, meaning that 6 justices agreed on the ruling and 3 dissented. So that's, again, I might be getting into too much detail and telling you things you already know, but that's kind of what it was. But in terms of what this ruling actually means, we'll start with the bad news. So the Supreme Court ruling, they ruled specifically that the pollution control systems that EPA employed as the basis for the 2015 Clean Power Plan, which was switching electricity generation from fossil fuels to clean energy sources, was outside of EPA's authority to regulate emissions from coal and gas-fired power plants. So the majority decided that the Clean Air Act does not permit EPA to write these regulations for power plants the way that it did in the Clean Power Plan. EPA leadership have announced that they do plan to write new regulations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from power plants to replace the Clean Power Plan and the ACE rule, which is great. But now EPA cannot base those regulations on achieving emissions reductions by switching from fossil fuels to clean sources. That's the big difference. So the decision removes this key tool out of EPA's regulatory toolbox, leaving it with fewer options to achieve the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that we need. Last piece of bad news that's a little bit more nebulous. The broader future implications of this case are pretty concerning and a little bit murky, and I am not a lawyer, so I will not try to get too far into it, but the decision demonstrates that the majority of the justices could be more inclined to overturn other major federal agency regulations in the future. And there are many open questions about what that may look like. So that's the bad news. On to the good news. This ruling does not block EPA from limiting greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. The Supreme Court upheld EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector, which is great. And there are multiple paths that remain strong for carbon pollution standards under the Clean Air Act. So this ruling does not block EPA from many other obligations and tools that has to reduce other dangerous pollution from the Clean Air Act, such as air toxics and ozone. And it does not block EPA's other climate actions that are already in the works, such as stronger greenhouse gas emissions for cars and limits on methane from the oil and gas industry. And the last thing I'll say before I get into what you all can do or consider doing, a great twist with the Inflation Reduction Act. Unbeknownst to us until recently, some smart congressional staff were actually able to slip in language in the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that defined carbon dioxide as an air pollutant, which is well within the legal charge provided by the Clean Air Act and means that it is important because it is explicitly coming from Congress that carbon dioxide is defined as an air pollutant. So that was great. In terms of, where do we go from here? And what can we do to help address climate change and air pollution on a national level? This Supreme Court decision means that urgent action from EPA is more important than ever. And some key priorities and some ways that the health community can help include, so EPA must act quickly under its remaining authority to establish new rules cutting greenhouse gases from fossil fuel power plants. They're working on that now, so we can keep an eye on it and help support that. EPA must also move forward with additional measures to reduce greenhouse gases, including from cutting methane from oil and gas, big oil and gas industry, and carbon emissions from vehicles. So there are some concrete opportunities for us there. On the vehicles front, we are still waiting on the rules that limit emissions from both cars and trucks. And we hope to have those out soon. And once we do have the proposals out on those, there will be a public comment period and public hearings that we can all weigh in on. And I can follow up too with Natalie and Natasha to make sure you have that information. And then on methane, we have an opportunity right now. So EPA is working on the next step on its plan to limit methane and other emissions from new and existing oil and gas operations. They issued their first proposal in 2021. which is an important step forward, but needed to go farther to address pollution concerns and protect health. So EPA is now working on a supplemental proposal to build on the first one with additional cleanup requirements. We need them to make it as strong as possible and then finalize all these new measures so they can take effect. So right now, the Lung Association has a letter specifically for health professionals around the country, calling on EPA to finalize these standards on emissions from new and existing oil and gas operations. And I will make sure you have that letter because we would love for all of you and your networks of health professionals to sign on to that and make it clear to EPA that these are really important and we need them as soon as possible. Okay, sorry, I know I'm long-winded here, but EPA must also move forward with additional regulations that would limit other dangerous air pollutants. So for example, EPA has the clear authority to finalize much needed updates to the national air pollution standards. And we also, the Lung Association has another letter right now calling on EPA to set stronger national limits on both particle pollution and ozone. And so we'll circulate that letter to you all as well. It's not limited to health professionals. So we would love to get as many signatures on that as possible. And I'll just wrap up by talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. So last but not least, Congress just passed the largest ever federal investment in addressing climate change. This is amazing. And the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't include everything we would have liked to see, but it is something big, and it does include some not so great investments. But again, on a whole, this law is a really big deal for improving air quality and reducing the impacts of climate change. In terms of where we go from here, the Lung Association is working to celebrate the good in the bill and gearing up to ensure that it is implemented in a way that best protects health. Getting the information about these programs out to the public and educating the public on how they will benefit health and will help solidify our defenses for these programs if and when they arise in the future. So there will be opportunities to weigh in with agencies as they determine the best way to get the money, like the grant programs at EPA, out the door. And last thing I'll say is really that it's important to note that everything that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act can easily be undone in future Congresses, not to bring us down after we're celebrating, but the same legislative tool that was used to pass the Inflation Reduction Act was used to attempt to get the Affordable Care Act in 2017. So that's why it's so important that we spread the word now about the benefits in this law so that there is a strong public opposition to any future attempts to weaken or gut it. And that is all that I have. I know I've taken up, I think, plenty of my time here, so I will turn it over to Julie, and then I guess we'll take questions at the end. Great.
Thanks, Diana. That was very comprehensive. So I'll just really add just a little bit on a few pieces, and then mostly be happy to help answer questions or further in the discussion. My name is Julie McNamara. I'm the Deputy Policy Director for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm based in Massachusetts. UCS has worked with APHA for a long time, especially my colleagues in our Center for Science and Democracy, which is really helping to ensure the role of scientists in the policymaking process, protecting federal scientists and the integrity of science. That came up a lot during the Trump administration in terms of defending against attacks on scientists and science-based policymaking, but it's also a proactive role and ensuring that science continues to be reflected and incorporated. And that especially comes up in the areas of public health, where we have seen again and again industry attempting to put in measures and calculations that undervalue the harmful effects of pollution on the public. And we know that already the numbers that we can use are far too low, don't reflect the reality and the complexity of on the ground experiences. And yet even there we struggle to get the basics. So my role generally, I do a lot of work at the national level on issues around the clean energy transition, both related to the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, as well as Congress. Away from the reconciliation bill was not a great time to be feeling good about our potential for climate action. And then we saw this come racing back to the fore, the Inflation Reduction Act, as Diana was just talking about at the end. So I do think it's valuable to bring attention to that and kind of balance these clear tensions where we do see commitment and investment in the future, while still seeing clear commitment and investment in holding this transition back. And we'll be fighting against that those continued attacks on this clean energy progress, as well as we're trying to be pushing for the uptake of all the opportunities that are now there. So I'll just say a few additional things I think about the West Virginia decision. The first, right, as Diana mentioned, it did not challenge EPA's authority to regulate power plant carbon emissions from existing power plants, right? That was the kind of background question, and they did not question their authority. They constrained their ability to set robust standards. And the implications of that are really, if EPA can only consider a really narrow set of approaches for setting a standard, then only it can minimally influence power sector emissions. And it's important to note how this section of the Clean Air Act works. EPA sets a carbon emission reduction standard, and then states have the flexibility to implement that in a wide range of ways. And in fact, the Supreme Court didn't say that states would be similarly constrained as EPA. So where EPA said, you can't consider, or where the Supreme Court said that EPA could not consider transitioning to renewables as a way to lower coal plant emissions, for example, to set a standard based on that, states still could. And that matters because one of the potential technologies on the table that EPA can consider moving down the line, right, if they're only limited to things that can be done at or to a facility, would be carbon capture. That's one of the few ways that you could, potentially move the needle more than a fraction of a percent if you're just burning coal a little more efficiently or burning gas a little more efficiently. The catch is carbon capture is really expensive. It hasn't been proved out, has a lot of issues with it. If EPA were to set a reduction standard based on carbon capture, though, you could imagine it then going to the state level and the state saying, no go on carbon capture. How we want to see these emission reductions happen is driving out renewables. That'll be cheaper, that'll be more efficient, and it's more durable over the long term as a solution. Now, this obviously introduces a lot of complexities if you're deeply concerned about the potential for carbon capture. And wanting to see EPA as a lever for clean energy transition progress. I think we'll continue to see this conversation come up over the coming months, right, before EPA produces its proposed standard in spring of next year, because I think this is going to be a really live issue. What are the options really available to EPA? And when we look at coal plants in particular, the two that could potentially reduce emissions more than 1% or 2% would be applying carbon capture at the facility or co-firing gas with coal. And neither of those are great. And so they'll be facing a lot of challenging conversations. I think it will be very important to be talking about the potential broader implications of these different approaches, right? The public health and pollutant implications of carbon capture, implementation of co-firing gas with NOx emissions and ongoing particulate matter pollution. The only other thing I'd say, right, Diana mentioned a bunch of other rulemakings at EPA around power plants related to public health, including particulate matters of soot and ozone. We'll also see some coal ash. One thing that the court made very clear in this ruling is that EPA cannot interpret its remit broadly. It really needs to stick to the bounds of what the court believes has been delegated to it. And I think that that's important to know when we talk about public health standards, because we know that all of these rules have co-benefits. When you reduce carbon emissions from a coal plant, you'll be concomitantly reducing air quality pollutants. It's important to recognize that. EPA should be valuing that. In the same way, when you reduce co-pollutants, so if you're at a specific pollutant standard, so for example, the mercury and air toxic standard that was applied to coal plants in the past, we know that at the same time that they were reducing mercury, carbon emissions would also be reduced. It makes sense to think about these things comprehensively. It is, in fact, something that's required of EPA. However, it's important not to make the case that these public health standards are, in fact, about climate, because they're not. And EPA certainly would not be able to make that case. So it's a small distinction, but it is an important one just in how we talk about and think about these things, right? These rules do obviously all fit together and together move the needle in where the power sector is going to a cleaner, lower carbon place, but they each have a specific role and purpose. And so some of those communications are really important, because I think it's very possible that the court will be quoting people back to themselves right down the road. The other implication I want to talk briefly about when it comes to this recent court ruling is what the court relied on to make this decision, which was effectively, they refer to it as the major questions doctrine, which is something that's come up in the court before, but this was the first time that it's been really explicitly relied upon. And in just the months since this ruling came out, we've already seen this pop up in briefs all across the country for multiple rulemakings. So I think it's really important to know exactly what it means. Of course, one of the most challenging things about it is that it doesn't mean much, or it could mean whatever the court wants it to mean. Generally, the court said, if you have an issue of, quote, vast economic or political significance, then Congress must be explicit in the directions that it gives to an agency. And that's how it said EPA was too broad in its interpretation for the previous Clean Power Plan. Right, if it had the potential to fully shift the energy sector, then Congress would have been explicit about that. And if Congress wasn't, then they had to go back to Congress and get that more specific direction. This is an arbitrary decision and framework. The court doesn't lay out, as it sometimes has, a series of tests for evaluating, if you meet condition A, B, and C, then we know it's a go or a no-go. This doesn't have any numerical for the vast economic or some other way to consider the political significance. It's kind of know it when you see it type of suggestion, and yet they've created this framework that they can now call upon whenever something rises to their own level of alarm, in a way that allows them to really inject themselves as policymakers and policy deciders in a way that the court has never been for these types of things. And it fundamentally changes how we think about deference to agencies and expertise. This was in the EPA ruling, but we know that there's nothing tying it to it. This can show up now across the board for all types of science-based rulemakings and court cases. And I think this is really important to know, because this really is a potentially arbitrary tool that could rear its head at really unknown times. One concern for us is that agencies may now start to act with hesitation because of it. I think that would be the wrong move. Agencies clearly have authority on all types of issue areas. And there would be no benefit, right? All these rules will be going to court no matter what. That's just how we currently have the system. Attorneys general across the country are bringing the agencies to court again and again and again. So it wouldn't avoid a court case, but it would defensively weaken the potential for what agencies can do. And so I think one of the things that absolutely will be wrestled with in the time ahead is the degree to which is kind of the strategy around what the major questions doctrine means, its implications, and how to engage with the reality of the fact that it's here now moving forward. To me, I think it means bringing as much evidence to bear for the justification of these rules and actions. And we know in the public health world, all of these rules are never as strong as they could be. There is just such an abundance of evidence that can back the agencies up. And they'll need that. They'll need that backing from technical experts across the board, I think now more than ever. So I would just say that as a final issue of importance. Finally, just related to the recently passed bill, two things I would mention. One, there are a range, as Diana said, it's a mixed bag. Without question, I think it will be incumbent on us to be pushing for as much uptake of the good as possible and defending against uptake of the bad and putting up guardrails wherever we can for those that could break either way. It's important to know beyond a lot of this law is just pushing money out the door to make the clean energy transition cheaper. So policies will need to drive that uptake. But there are some very specific grant programs related to especially communities and really focused on air pollution and air pollution reductions, including around diesel emission reductions and around ports. There are a number of these types of programs. I think it's really valuable from a public health perspective to be looking into some of these because they can directly target polluters and help to make local community air quality better. There's also a fair bit of funding for air quality monitoring, right? Which we know community air quality monitoring has been a long problem. Those gaps continue to mean that the lack of data means lack of accountability. So that's another valuable piece. And I think I'll leave it there. Happy to field any questions if Raz, you have them.